He spat on her at his mother's dinner table. Not beside her. Not near her. At her, a single deliberate act, witnessed by 8 people who all found somewhere else to look. Her name was Renata. She was 7 months pregnant, sitting across from the man she had married 6 years earlier, and she did not flinch. She did not cry. She set her fork down on the edge of her plate with a quiet click that was the only sound in the room, and she looked at him with an expression nobody at that table had the vocabulary to read. What James Voss did not know, what his mother, Diane, positioned at the head of the table like a woman presiding over something she had built, did not know. What Roy Voss, James's father, retired and comfortable on a pension he had never once questioned the origin of, did not know, was that the woman James had just humiliated was the sole owner of the company that had signed every one of their paychecks for the past 30 years, the trucks outside bearing the Voss name, the freight routes James called his, the holding company whose assets he was, at that very moment, attempting to use as collateral for a loan he had not told his wife about. All of it, every last piece of it, belonged to Renata. It had always belonged to Renata, and she had not said a word. This isn't just a story about a man who humiliated his wife at a family dinner. It's about what happens when the person everyone overlooked turns out to be the person who owned the table they were sitting at. If this story is already pulling at something in you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Stories like this one exist because of this community. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now, to understand what Renata did next, we have to go back to where this really began. Not with James, and not with that dinner table, but with a woman named Josephine, a freight yard on the south side of Charlotte, and a lesson about whose name actually matters. Her name was Josephine Moreau's daughter, and she had been coming to this house for 6 years. That is where we need to begin. Not with the dinner table, not with the sound of forks going quiet, but with a woman named Josephine who built something from almost nothing on the south side of Charlotte, North Carolina, starting in 1971, and who understood long before the end of her life that the most dangerous thing a woman could do with real power was advertise it. Josephine's daughter, Renata, had learned this lesson the way children learn the things that matter most, not from a lecture, but from watching. From Saturday mornings in the dispatch office, sitting in the big chair behind the routing desk while her mother stood at the window reading freight, manifests the way other women read novels. From the way Josephine signed documents, unhurried, certain, as if the pen belonged in her hand. From the way she drove the same Buick for 11 years, while the company's fleet expanded to 63 trucks, because Josephine Moreau had always understood something most people never figure out. Visible wealth is a target. Quiet wealth is a foundation. The foundation was called Renata M. Holdings, LLC, filed with the North Carolina Secretary of State on a Tuesday afternoon in October, the year Renata turned 30. Wallace Dupre had prepared the paperwork. Josephine had signed it in his office on East Trade Street, then driven home in the old Buick without mentioning it to anyone except Wallace, because there was nothing to mention yet. It was simply a thing that had been built and now existed, and would wait. The way good things built carefully are always willing to wait. Renata understood what she had inherited. She did not wear it. She did not speak of it. She carried it the way her mother had taught her, in the paper, not on the door. And then she met James Voss at a company retreat in the fall of her 31st year, and he was charming in the specific way that moves quickly past a woman's careful instincts, and she hired him as a logistics consultant, and within 18 months she had married him, and she had told herself, honestly, not strategically, because Renata Moreau was never strategic about the people she loved, that she would tell him about the LLC when she was certain. When she knew, the way her mother had always said, "You know," not with your heart, but with something quieter and harder to name. She never became certain. And then Josephine was gone, and the grief of that was so large and so heavy that Renata could not locate the edges of it for months, and by the time she surfaced, the company was already being called Voss Meridian on the trucks. James had not asked her. He had not told her. He had simply done it. The way men who mistake access for ownership always simply do things. And when Renata mentioned it, gently, carefully, in the voice she used when she was trying not to make something into more than it was, James had said it was a brand refresh, and it tested better with clients. And she had looked at him across the kitchen and heard her mother's voice somewhere below her sternum. Quiet and precise. A name on a door means nothing, Renata. The name on the paper is the one that matters. She had let it go. She would let a great many things go over the next 4 years, in the way that women who love people they are slowly losing will let things go. Not from weakness, not from fear, but from the persistent, exhausting hope that the person they married is still somewhere inside the person standing in front of them. He was not by the time of that Sunday dinner. Or if he was buried somewhere Renata no longer had the energy to excavate. The Voss family dinners had been a monthly ritual since the first year of the marriage. Diane ran them with the precision of a woman who believed that a properly laid table was a moral statement. And the house in Concord, Roy and Diane's house, the house James had grown up in, was always exactly right, always warm and pressed and arranged, and Renata had spent 6 years in that dining room, understanding precisely how welcome she was by the temperature of the silences Diane allowed to settle over her. What Diane did not know, and what Roy did not know, and what James, who had spent 4 years running a company he believed was his, certainly did not know, was the thing the audience already understands by now. Roy Voss had spent 19 years as a regional manager at Moreau Freight. He had taken his salary from the same accounts Josephine signed. He had received his retirement package, the one that paid the Concord mortgage, that covered Diane's medical plan, that funded the comfortable quiet of this house, from a benefit structure Josephine Moreau had established in 1998. The pension Roy collected every month had originated in the same holding company that Renata had owned since her 30th birthday. They were his family. They had been her employees. They had never once connected the two facts, and neither had James, because James had never thought to look, and because Renata had never told him, and because the name on the door was Voss now, and the Voss men had always believed what they saw on doors. The irony in that dining room was so dense it had weight, and not one person at that table felt it. Not yet. Louis Moreau did not start with much. He had a second-hand flatbed truck, a route map he had drawn by hand on a piece of graph paper, and an understanding of the roads between Charlotte and Greensboro that he had accumulated over 30 years of driving them for other people. In the spring of 1971, at the age of 41, he decided to drive them for himself. He called the company Moreau Freight. He painted the name on the truck door himself, in careful block letters, using a brush he borrowed from a neighbor and never returned. What Louis understood, and what he passed down to his daughter the way certain men pass down land or scripture, was that the roads did not care whose name was on the truck. The roads cared only about weight and weather and the hours between pickup and delivery. Show up on time. Carry what you promised to carry. Let the work speak in a language that needed no translation. By 1978, he had 4 trucks. By 1983, he had 11, and a proper dispatch office on Westover Hills Boulevard in Charlotte, and a regional manager position he needed to fill. The man who took that job in 1984 was named Roy Voss. He was 30 years old, punctual, good with numbers, and he stayed for 19 years. He is not significant to this part of the story. He will become significant later. For now, note only that Roy Voss drew his salary from Moreau Freight's payroll every second Friday for nearly 2 decades, and that the retirement package he received in 2003, the one that covered the Concord mortgage, and Diane's medical plan, and the comfortable quiet of the life they had built, was administered through a benefits structure that Lewis's daughter, Josephine, had formalized in 1998. Roy Voss never knew whose hands those benefits had passed through. He never thought to ask. Josephine Moreau inherited the company when Louis died in 1991. She was 38 years old and had been working in the dispatch office since she was 25, and she did not grieve publicly or loudly because her father had not raised her to perform her interior life for an audience. She modernized the fleet. She negotiated 3 new regional contracts in the first year alone. She restructured the company twice over the following decade, once for growth, once for protection, and by the time she was done, Moreau Freight operated 63 trucks across 4 states, and its legal architecture was a quietly elegant thing that an outside observer might have described as excessive caution, and that Josephine would have simply called good sense. Renata grew up inside the hum of it. Saturday mornings in the dispatch office, sitting in the routing chair while Josephine stood at the window reading manifests. Summer breaks spent learning the difference between a bill of lading and a freight invoice, between a line haul rate and a fuel surcharge. She did not experience this as an education. She experienced it as simply being near her mother, which was where she most wanted to be. The business was the medium through which Josephine expressed everything she could not say plainly: her ambition, her standards, her love. There was one thing Josephine said plainly. She said it in the context of a contract dispute when Renata was 12 years old, watching a man argue with her mother about whose name should appear first on a joint venture agreement. Josephine waited for him to finish. Then she said, "A name on a door means nothing. The name on the paper is the one that matters." The man looked at her for a long moment and then moved his name to second position. Renata did not fully understand what she had witnessed. She filed it away the way children file the things that feel important before they know why. She understood it by the time she was 30. That was the October morning Wallace Duproux set a document on his desk at his office on East Trade Street and slid it across to her and said simply, "Sign here." The document was the operating agreement for Renata M. Holdings, LLC, a corporate structure Wallace had spent 4 months building to Josephine's specifications. It transferred 100% controlling interest in Moreau Freight. All assets, all contracts, all 63 trucks, all of it, into a holding company registered solely in Renata's name, predating any future marital claim, structured as separate property under North Carolina law. Renata signed it on a Tuesday. Josephine watched from the chair beside the window. Neither of them said very much. She intended to tell the right person someday, when she was certain. Then something arrived that felt like certainty. James Voss came to a company logistics retreat in the fall of her 31st year. He was representing a small consulting firm, his own, as it happened, which was a detail she found appealing without quite knowing why. He had prepared a 40-minute presentation on route optimization that was genuinely good, the kind of good that comes from a person who has actually thought carefully about a problem, rather than performed thinking at it. Renata hired him. 6 months later, she was having dinner with him at a restaurant on South Tryon Street. And 6 months after that, she was considering what it might mean to build a life alongside someone whose competence she respected and whose company she sought out without effort. She loved him. That is the part of this story that is easiest to miss and most important to hold. She loved him genuinely, and she intended to tell him about the LLC. And she did not because the window kept not being quite the right moment. And then Josephine was sick. And then Josephine was gone. And grief has a way of making every window feel sealed shut. They married in June 2019, 14 months after she hired him. The ceremony was small. Wallace attended and shook James's hand and said it was a pleasure to meet him. And he meant it. And he said nothing else about his professional relationship with Renata's family, because Renata had not asked him to. She had not asked him to stay quiet either. She had simply not asked. And Wallace Dupré, who had been Josephine Moreau's attorney for 26 years by then, understood that some things are held at the right moment, or not at all. There is one more thing from that first year that belongs here before the story moves forward. A small thing. Easy to miss. 3 months before the wedding, James sent Renata a draft email he wanted her to review, a pitch to a new regional client. It was well written, confident, the right length. At the bottom, beneath his signature, he had written the company's name. Not Moreau Freight, not Moreau Meridian. Voss Meridian Solutions. Just like that. As if it were already true. Renata read it twice. Something shifted in her chest, not loudly. She replied with 2 small edits to the pitch language, and said nothing about the name. She filed it away. The way her mother had taught her to file the things that feel important before you know why. Josephine died on a Wednesday morning in March 2020, in a room at Carolina's Medical Center on Blythe Boulevard, with Renata holding her right hand, and the room quiet, and the March light coming through the blinds in pale, even strips. She was 67 years old. She had lived exactly the life she intended to live. Wallace called that afternoon. He said, "The file is secure. Everything is in order. I'll be here when you need me." The LLC sat, intact, patient, bearing one name only. The marriage that had begun in warmth began, without announcement, its quiet turn. The turn did not happen all at once. That is the thing about a slow erosion. You do not feel it moving. You feel only the results, arriving one at a time, spaced far enough apart that each one seems like an isolated event, rather than part of a pattern. Renata would understand the pattern eventually. But understanding a pattern and stopping it are 2 different things. And for a long time she was still trying to stop it with the tools of love, which are patience and accommodation, and the persistent belief that the person you married is capable of finding their way back to who they were. The first tool to fail her was patience. In the 2nd year of the marriage, James hired a new operations manager, a man named Derek Stills, who had come from a regional carrier in Raleigh, and who called James by his first name and deferred to him on everything. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the way it changed the temperature of the Charlotte office when Renata came in. Derek Stills was unfailingly polite to her. He was also unfailingly vague. Questions she asked about routing decisions received, answers that redirected her toward James. Emails she sent to the operations chain received, replies that were technically responsive and completely uninformative. She was not excluded loudly. She was excluded gently, door by door, in the manner of a building being quietly repurposed while its original owner is still inside. She told herself James was building his team. She told herself this was what growth looked like. She told herself a great many things that kept the shape of the marriage intact while the interior of it shifted without her permission. Then came the industry dinner at the Marriott on East Independence Boulevard in the spring of their 3rd year, when James introduced Renata to a table of regional logistics contacts with the words, "And this is my wife. She's at home with us right now, not working." He said it easily. He said it the way people say things they have already said many times privately and have stopped noticing. The men at the table smiled pleasantly. Renata's hand was still on James's arm. She left it there. She smiled back. She did not say that she had been the operational backbone of the company those men were currently doing business with. She did not say anything at all. Something cracked inside her that evening. Not loudly, but completely. Diane began appearing at the house more frequently around this same period. First for Sunday dinners, then for Tuesday afternoons, then for long Saturday visits that colonized the kitchen and the living room, with the particular authority of a woman who has decided that her presence is a gift, and its terms are not negotiable. She had opinions about the house. She delivered them in the register of helpfulness. The kitchen would flow better if the island were cleared. Renata might consider a different color for the nursery, something less busy. Have you thought about getting back into something, even part-time? It must be hard, watching James carry so much. She said this last one, with her head tilted and her voice soft, to Carl's wife, within clear hearing distance of Renata, in the kitchen of Renata's own home. Renata was 6 months pregnant by then, moving carefully between the counter and the refrigerator, her rounded stomach making the kitchen feel smaller than it was. She set a glass down on the counter and said nothing. He didn't notice. He never noticed. It was in the 4th year that the name appeared for the first time. Saoirse Ellery, junior architect, contracted to Voss Meridian through a design subgroup working on a warehouse expansion project in Gastonia. The name came up first on James's phone screen, briefly visible on the kitchen counter one morning while Renata was making coffee. A text preview, nothing explicit. A question about a project file. She registered it the way you register a word in a language you don't speak. Present, unreadable, filed. Then it appeared in an expense report. A dinner for 2 at Sterling's Steakhouse on East Moorhead Street, filed under Client Entertainment, dated a Tuesday in October. $147. 2 glasses of wine. Renata sat with this for 6 weeks. She told herself hormones. She told herself insecurity. She told herself that the particular anxiety of late pregnancy makes the mind find shapes in shadows that aren't there. And she was almost convincing. And then she went to a company function at the Westin on South McDowell and watched James introduce Saoirse Ellery to a group of contractors with a warmth that moved differently in his face than anything she had seen from him in 2 years. Not louder, not more demonstrative, just warmer. The specific warmth of a person who is glad, all the way through, to be in someone's company. Renata stood across the room with a glass of water and watched this for approximately 45 seconds. Then she looked at the floor. Then she looked at the ceiling. Then she looked at nothing in particular and breathed carefully, the way a woman 7 months pregnant breathes when she is trying to keep her face from becoming something other people will ask about. She went home before the dinner portion of the evening began. She told James she was tired. He said, of course, go. And he kissed her on the cheek, with his eyes already moving back to the room. 3 weeks later, Renata opened the quarterly fleet report that had been automatically forwarded to her personal email, one of the few operational threads that still included her name on the distribution list, probably because no one had thought to remove it. The report was formatted differently than it had been the previous quarter. The masthead had been redesigned. The company name, printed across the top in the new sans serif font James had approved for the rebrand, read, Voss Meridian Solutions. Not Moreau Meridian Logistics. Not even Moreau Meridian. The name her grandfather had painted on a truck door in 1971 was gone from the document entirely, as if it had simply been deleted, as if it had never mattered enough to protect. Renata held the report in both hands. Her breath came slow and deliberate. The baby shifted against her ribs, and somewhere in the quiet of that moment, without ceremony or announcement, she heard her mother's voice for the first time since the funeral. Calm, precise, patient as a deed in a filing cabinet. A name on a door means nothing. The name on the door was Voss now. The audience already knows whose name was on the paper. James was about to discover, too late, that those are never the same thing. The name on the door was only the beginning. In the months that followed, James moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had convinced himself that what he was doing was simply organizing, tidying, making things cleaner and more functional. He called it accounting simplification. He used that phrase with the practiced ease of someone who has said it enough times to believe it. What it meant, in the operational reality of Voss Meridian Solutions' internal documents, was this. Every reference to Renata M. Holdings LLC as the controlling entity was reclassified in the working files to read third-party institutional backer. The change was made across 17 internal documents over the course of 6 weeks. Derek Stills processed the paperwork without asking questions, because Derek Stills had learned, as everyone around James had learned, that questions were not the language of this office. James told Renata about it on a Wednesday evening, while she stood at the kitchen counter going through mail. He said it was routine. He said it streamlined the investor-facing materials. He said the external documents were unaffected, which was true, and which was also the detail he was betting she would not think to verify. She looked at him for a moment. Her hands, resting on a utility bill, did not move. She said, "Okay." And she turned back to the mail. He had no idea that she already knew what the external documents said. She had known since October. She knew because she had read Renata M. Holdings LLC's North Carolina Secretary of State filing every year since Wallace Dupre had registered it, the way her mother had read freight manifests, not because she distrusted the document, but because a thing you own deserves your attention. The irony, in those weeks, was dense enough to stand on. The SBA loan application was filed in late November. James worked on it for 3 weeks with his CFO, a compact and precise man named Gerald Hartwell, who had joined the company 14 months earlier and who understood his role to be the implementation of James's decisions, not the evaluation of them. The application was for $4.8 million, filed against Voss Meridian Solutions' asset base, intended to fund a warehouse expansion in Gastonia that would have represented the largest single growth move in the company's history. James did not mention the application to Renata. He did not believe her involvement was necessary. He believed in the specific way of a man who has slowly rewritten a story until he believes it himself, that the assets he was collateralizing were his to collateralize. The loan officer assigned to the file was a woman named Patricia Ose, who worked out of the SBA's Charlotte District office on West Trade Street. Patricia Ose was methodical and thorough. When she pulled the LLC registration to verify the asset ownership structure, she found a name that did not match the applicant. She found it because it had always been there. It had never been changed. No one in James's operation had thought to look at the public registration, because the public registration was the kind of document that only matters when it matters, and James had proceeded on the assumption that it would never matter. Patricia Ose called the beneficial owner on file. Her call came through on a Tuesday morning in December, while Renata was standing in the produce section of the Harris Teeter on Providence Road, 8 months pregnant, one hand resting on her lower back, and the other on a shopping cart she was using as a brace. The phone showed an unfamiliar number with a Charlotte area code. She answered it. Patricia Ose introduced herself and her office and the purpose of her call. She asked Renata to confirm her role as the registered beneficial owner of Renata M. Holdings, LLC, and her relationship to the collateral listed in a Small Business Administration loan application filed by Voss Meridian Solutions. The produce section hummed around Renata. Someone's child knocked something over 2 aisles away. Renata looked at a display of navel oranges for a long moment and said yes, she could confirm that. It was the first time anyone from the company had called her in over 2 years. She thanked Patricia Osei. She said she would be in touch. She placed the phone in her coat pocket and stood very still for a breath, her hand still on the cart, the weight of the baby pressing down through her hips. And then she put 3 oranges in a bag with the careful attention of a person who needs something ordinary to hold on to. She drove home. She had been in Wallace Dupree's office by that point for 3 weeks. The business card Patricia Osei had emailed her was already printed and waiting. 3 weeks earlier, Diane had gathered the family for a birthday celebration for Roy, dinner at the house in Concord, the good tablecloth, the good china. James and Renata arrived together. Renata moved slowly by then, her body 8 months heavy, steadying herself on door frames and chair backs with a grace that came from practice. Diane was in the kitchen when they arrived, and she welcomed them with the efficiency of a woman who has timed every element of a meal to the minute. And when 2 of Roy's former colleagues from the freight industry arrived, men named Ted Warwick and Dave Cousins, who had stayed in Renata's father's social orbit long after Roy retired, Diane had walked them through the living room, with a hand on each arm, and said, with the confidence of a woman making an introduction she had rehearsed, "You know James, of course. He built Voss Meridian from nothing. Really remarkable what he's done." Roy nodded from his armchair. Carl lifted his drink. Renata stood 3 feet away, one hand resting on her rounded stomach, and neither Ted Warwick nor Dave Cousins looked at her at all. While he mocked her uselessness, she was the reason the room was warm. She didn't say that. She didn't say anything. She accepted a glass of water from Diane's assistant and moved toward a chair and sat down carefully, and the conversation flowed past her the way conversations do when a room has decided, collectively and without discussion, that someone is furniture. And then the following Sunday, there was the dinner, the one we already know, the wine-soaked tablecloth, the comment about the truck livery, the silence that followed what James did, and the stillness on Renata's face, and Diane's recovery, and Roy's continued and practiced nothing. Now the audience has the full picture, every layer of it, the pension Roy collects, sourced from Josephine's benefit structure, the medical coverage Diane has never once questioned the origin of, the trucks James called his, the name he was certain he had buried. All of it existing simultaneously in that dining room, while the woman who owned it sat across from the man who had just spat at her, and kept her face composed and her hands still. She drove home. She set her coat on the kitchen chair. She opened Josephine's old desk, the one she had moved from the Charlotte office after Josephine died, the one with the worn brass handles and the shallow center drawer that stuck slightly in damp weather. And she placed Patricia Osei's business card in the center of the blotter. She opened Wallace Dupree's number on her phone. She did not dial. Not yet. She sat at Josephine's desk in the quiet of the house and let the night settle around her, and she looked at the card, and she looked at the name on the phone screen, and she breathed. By morning, she knew exactly what she was going to do. She left before the sky had any color in it. James was asleep. She had lain beside him for 3 hours without closing her eyes, listening to his breathing settle into the long, unconscious rhythm of a man with no particular weight on his chest. And at 4:47 in the morning she had risen carefully, her body stiff and slow with the final weeks of pregnancy. And she had dressed in the dark without turning on a light. She took her coat from the kitchen chair where she had left it. She took her keys. She took Patricia Osei's business card from the center of Josephine's desk blotter, slid it into her coat pocket, and she left. The Buick started on the first turn, the way it always did. Josephine had maintained it fastidiously, oil changes every 4 months, Tires rotated every 6, the same mechanic on Wilkinson Boulevard for 11 years. And the engine's reliability felt, in the particular silence of that early morning, like one more thing her mother had arranged to still be present when Renata needed it. She pulled out of the driveway without turning on the headlights until she reached the street. She did not know where she was going. She drove. Charlotte at 5 in the morning is not empty, but it is quiet in a way the city manages only briefly, between the last of the night and the first of the day, when the roads belong to nurses finishing shifts and delivery drivers and the occasional person who simply needed to be in motion rather than still. Renata drove south on Providence, then west without deciding to, then onto the interchange that feeds into the center of the city, the skyline appearing ahead of her in the dark with its familiar arrangement of lit windows, and she did not choose her destination so much as arrive at it, the way the body sometimes knows before the mind catches up. The parking structure on West Moorhead Street, the one attached to the building at 1140 West Moorhead. The address that had appeared on every Moreau freight invoice from 1988 onward. The address still registered to Renata M. Holdings, LLC, as its principal place of business, a space Renata had not entered in 2 years. She pulled into the structure and took the first available space on the second level and turned off the engine and sat. The concrete around her was gray and particular, the kind of specific utilitarian place that holds no beauty and makes no pretense of it, and there was something steadying in that. No performance required. She put both hands flat on her thighs and looked through the windshield at the wall in front of her, and she let herself be quiet in a way she had not managed inside the house. She thought about her mother. Not the end of her, not the hospital room or the March light through the blinds, but earlier, Josephine at the window of this very building reading a manifest, Josephine signing the LLC operating agreement without ceremony, without speech, with only the deliberate pressure of a pen moving across a line that had been prepared for her. Josephine saying, "A name on a door means nothing. The name on the paper is the one that matters." She had always understood those words as practical instruction. A lesson in legal architecture, in the difference between appearance and ownership, between the name that occupies space and the name that holds title. She had filed them in the part of her mind reserved for her mother's professional wisdom, next to the freight routing principles and the client management philosophy and the patient, exact way Josephine had always read a contract before signing anything. Sitting in that parking structure at 5 in the morning, 8 months pregnant, with her husband's contempt still living somewhere in her body the way that kind of thing does, she understood that her mother had not been giving her a business lesson. She had been giving her a prophecy. She had seen, with the particular clarity of a woman who had watched men rewrite her own story her entire career, exactly what kind of man would one day stand in her daughter's life. She had built the paper before Renata had even met him. She had made certain the paper could not be moved. The name on the trucks was Voss. It had been Voss for 6 years. The name on the paper had always been Moreau. It would be Moreau when the trucks were repainted. It would be Moreau when the masthead was restored. It would be Moreau on every filing and registration and legal record that existed independently of whatever James had printed on his business cards. Renata took her phone from her coat pocket. She found Wallace Dupre's name in her contacts. The entry simply read, Wallace, the way it had since Josephine added it there years ago, and Renata had never changed it. She pressed call. It was 5:17 in the morning. He answered on the second ring. He said her name. That was all, just her name, but in the voice of a man who had been waiting for a call that might come at any hour, and had made his peace with that. She told him. She told him about the Sunday dinner and what James had done in front of his parents. She told him about the SBA loan application and Patricia Osie's call and the $4.8 million James had attempted to borrow against assets he did not own. She told him about the 17 internal documents Gerald Hartwell had reclassified as accounting simplification. She was precise, and she was calm, and she did not embellish, and she did not cry. Wallace listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your grandfather always said the freight always comes back to the freight yard, baby. Let's go get your yard back." She exhaled. Slow. Complete. "Proceed," she said. "I'll have documents ready before end of week," he said. "Don't sign anything. Don't move anything. Don't tell him." "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. And that was the end of the conversation. She sat with the phone in her lap for another few minutes. The parking structure around her was unchanged. The wall was still concrete. The fluorescent light above her still buzzed faintly. The city outside was still gathering itself toward morning. Nothing looked different. Everything was different. The narrator wants to mark this moment precisely because it is the pivot point on which the whole story turns. Before this morning, every description of Renata in this story has reached for the same set of words: patient, enduring, absorbing, accommodating, still. Those words were accurate. They described a woman doing the hard work of keeping something alive that was dying, using the only tools available to her, which were love and hope, and the persistent refusal to give up on a person who had long since given up on her. After this morning, the stillness remained. The composure remained. But its source had changed entirely. She was no longer still because she was waiting. She was still because she had decided. Those are not the same stillness. They only look the same from the outside. She got out of the car. She crossed the second level of the parking structure and took the stairs down to street level and walked to the entrance of 1140 West Moorhead and stood in front of the glass doors and looked at the lobby inside. The same lobby, the same reception desk her mother had stood behind in the early years, the same tile floor she had crossed 1,000 times as a child, trailing behind Josephine with a notebook and a question about rote optimization. She was not ready to go in yet. She knew she would be. She turned and walked back to the Buick and drove home through a city that was finally, slowly, beginning to wake. 3 weeks passed. Wallace prepared. The SBA closing meeting was scheduled for a Thursday in January at 10 in the morning in a conference room on Trade Street. James did not tell Renata about it. He had no reason to. He did not know she already had the date. The conference room on Trade Street was on the 4th floor, and it had the unremarkable efficiency of all rooms built for the transaction of business. A long table, 8 chairs, a window that faced west, fluorescent light softened by a dropped ceiling. James arrived at 9:45 with Gerald Hartwell beside him, both of them in dark suits, Gerald carrying a leather portfolio and James carrying the particular ease of a man who has convinced himself that the outcome of a meeting is already settled. He shook hands with the 2 bank officers, a senior lending manager named Paul Esterheisen, and his associate, a younger woman named Karen Riddle, and with the holding company's registered agent, a gray-haired man named Thomas Price, who had administered legal filings for a dozen Charlotte businesses for 30 years, and who had the mild, unhurried manner of someone who has sat in many rooms like this one and found them all equally unremarkable. James did not notice the empty chairs on the far side of the table. He was not looking for them. Thomas Price opened his file at 10 o'clock exactly. He was there to confirm the ownership structure of Renata M. Holdings, LLC, for the purpose of the loan's collateral verification, a routine step, procedural, the kind of administrative confirmation that in every previous closing of this type had taken approximately 4 minutes and attracted no particular attention. He found the registered filing. He read from it, for the record, the name of the beneficial owner. Renata Moreau, not Renata Voss. On every document in this file, filed with the North Carolina Secretary of State, she was not his wife. She was her mother's daughter. The name her grandfather had painted on a truck door in 1971. Paul Esterhuizen's pen stopped moving. He looked up from his notepad. Karen Riddle, beside him, glanced from Thomas Price to James with the careful neutrality of a professional who has learned not to react before she understands what she is reacting to. James heard the name. Something happened in his face, not collapse, not yet, but a kind of interior stillness. The split second of a man whose mind has registered an error and has not yet determined its size. He looked at Gerald. Gerald was already looking at the door. Then the door opened. Renata walked in. She was postpartum. 8 days past the birth, moving with the careful deliberateness of a body that is recovering and knows it, one hand briefly touching the back of a chair for steadiness as she crossed to the far side of the table. She was wearing a dark wool blazer over a simple white shirt, her natural hair pulled back, and she carried Josephine's leather briefcase, the same one, worn at the brass corners, with the small water stain on the bottom left panel that had been there since Renata was 12 years old. Wallace Dupré came in behind her, small and precise and unhurried, and took the chair to her left. James said nothing. The room said nothing. The fluorescent light above the table buzzed once, faintly, and then was quiet. Wallace opened his briefcase. He did not look at James. He placed 3 documents on the table in sequence, moving with the economy of a man who has rehearsed this moment in some form for years, without knowing exactly when it would arrive. The first document was the certified operating agreement for Renata M. Holdings, LLC, dated October 14th, 4 years before the marriage. Wallace said, without inflection, "The beneficial owner of the collateral asset is Renata Moreau. This predates the marriage by 4 years and is registered as separate property under North Carolina statute. The internal reclassification of this entity in Voss Meridian's working documents does not alter the public registration, which has never changed." Gerald Hartwell opened his mouth. He closed it. The second document was the original 1971 Moreau Freight Incorporation filing, bearing Louis Moreau's signature in blue ink that had faded to the color of shallow water. Wallace said, "This establishes the asset lineage. The company currently operating as Voss Meridian Solutions is the successor entity to Moreau Freight, Incorporated, which was restructured into Renata M. Holdings, LLC, in 2002. The holding company has had one beneficial owner throughout its existence." Paul Esterhuizen set his pen down entirely. He and Karen Riddle exchanged a look that lasted less than 2 seconds and communicated a full sentence. The third document. Wallace placed it flat on the table and said, "This is formal notice of Ms. Moreau's intent to exercise her rights as sole beneficial owner and to reclaim full operational authority over Renata M. Holdings, LLC, and all subsidiary entities, effective at the close of business today." He paused for the length of one breath. "The loan cannot proceed. The collateral is not Mr. Voss's to encumber." The room went very still. Gerald Hartwell said, "I need to request a recess." Paul Esterhuizen looked at the documents in front of him, then at James, and said with the careful precision of a man managing a significant institutional problem, "I don't think a recess changes what we're looking at, Mr. Hartwell." Wallace said nothing. He folded his hands on the table. It was James who finally spoke. He looked across the table at Renata, at her composed face, at the briefcase, at the woman he had introduced at industry dinners as not working, the woman he had removed from emails to let her rest, the woman whose name he had painted over on 63 trucks. and he said her name. Just her name. The way a person says a word when they are hoping it still opens something. She looked at him. There was no performance in her expression. No satisfaction, no contempt, no grief that hadn't already been grieved in private. She looked at him the way her mother had once looked at a man arguing about whose name should appear first on a contract, with the calm certainty of a woman who already knows what the paper says. "You put your name on my grandfather's trucks, James," she said. "You forgot to check the title." The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room completely, without echo, without exit. Karen Riddle gathered the bank's documents into a neat stack. Thomas Price closed his file. Gerald Hartwell stared at the table's surface as if he might find a different outcome in the grain of the wood. Wallace stood. Renata stood beside him, her hand resting briefly on the leather briefcase before she lifted it. They walked to the door together. She did not look back at the table. She did not look back at James. She moved through the doorway and into the corridor with the steady, unhurried gait of a woman who has somewhere to be and knows exactly where it is. Behind her, in the conference room on the 4th floor of a building on Trade Street in Charlotte, North Carolina, James Voss sat alone in a chair at a table surrounded by documents that all said the same thing. And the consequences arrived in waves. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They arrived the way Josephine had always said the truth arrives, steadily, without drama, one document at a time. James's formal removal from the directorial position was processed over 60 days through Wallace's office. The settlement agreement awarded him a severance package calculated according to the compensation structure of Moreau Freight's original 1998 HR documentation. The same structure, Wallace noted without commentary, under which Roy Voss had once received his own benefits. The number was fair. It was not generous. James signed it in a conference room he would not be returning to, with a pen that belonged to someone else, and Gerald Hartwell drove him home because James had not thought to arrange his own transportation. Serse Ellery did not return his calls. Not that afternoon, not the following week, not at all. She had built her understanding of James Voss on a specific set of visible facts: the company name on the trucks, the title on the masthead, the ease with which he moved through rooms as a man who owned something. And when those facts were publicly and legally corrected, the architecture of her interest simply had nothing left to stand on. She did not explain this. She did not need to. Diane wrote a letter. It arrived at Renata's new address on a Tuesday in February, in a cream envelope with Diane's return address printed in the upper left corner, in the neat, deliberate hand of a woman who had taught penmanship for 22 years. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph offered context. The second paragraph offered more context. The third paragraph contained one sentence that began with the word "sorry" and continued for longer than it needed to. Renata read it at Josephine's desk, folded it along its original creases, and placed it in the shallow center drawer that stuck slightly in damp weather. She did not respond. Roy was the one no one had predicted. He had always been the quiet man, the nodding man, the man who deferred and looked away and let things pass. But Roy was also a man who kept records in his head the way accountants keep them on paper, and sometime in the weeks following the Trade Street meeting, doing the arithmetic of his own working life, the letterhead, the benefits structure, the retirement package that had arrived without his ever questioning its origin. Something settled into place in Roy Voss that could not be unsettled. He did not speak to James for 4 months. He did not explain this to Diane. He simply became, for the first time in their shared life, a man with a position he had arrived at on his own. James appeared at Renata's door on a Thursday evening in March. She was in the kitchen, The twins asleep in the next room, the house holding the specific quiet of 2 infants who have just gone down and may or may not stay that way. She heard the knock. She knew his knock, 6 years of it, the way it landed slightly too firmly, as if knocking were itself a performance of confidence. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the silence after it. Then she walked to the door and said, without opening it, "Wallace handles all communication." There was a pause on the other side, long enough for her to hear him breathe. Then she heard his footsteps moving back toward the street, and she returned to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment with both hands flat on the surface, and then she put the kettle on. She did not open the door. The scene softens now into something quieter. The Charlotte office at 1140 West Moorhead had been emptied of the Voss Meridian branding by the end of January, the logo panels taken down, the new stationery ordered, the fleet notification filed with the North Carolina DMV for the 63 trucks that had been carrying the wrong name for 6 years. Renata moved in on the 1st of February with a box of her mother's things and a travel bassinet for the twins, who slept in the back office with the white noise machine Renata had brought from home. She hung Louis Moreau's photograph on the wall behind the main desk, the one taken in 1971, the first truck parked at an angle on a gravel lot in the South Charlotte sun, Louis standing beside it with one hand on the door and the expression of a man who has just done something that cannot be undone and is not sorry. She looked at it for a long time the morning she hung it. Then she sat down and opened her laptop and went to work. The new sign was installed on a Wednesday morning in early March by a crew of 3 from a signage company on South Boulevard. Renata watched from inside while they worked, her coffee going cold on the windowsill beside her. When the old panel came down, Voss Meridian Solutions, in the sans serif font James had approved for the rebrand, she felt nothing dramatic. What she felt was more like the release of something that had been held at an angle for too long and was finally allowed to rest flat. The new panel went up. Moreau Meridian Logistics, the original typeface. Louis's name first, where it had always belonged. She called her grandmother in Baton Rouge. Celestine Moreau, 84 years old, Louis's wife, who had outlasted her husband by 33 years and her daughter by 3, and who answered the phone on the second ring with the voice of a woman who has decided not to waste any of her remaining time on hesitation. Renata held the phone to the window so Celestine could hear the crew on the pavement below, gathering their tools, loading the old panel into the truck. There was a silence on the line, long enough that Renata checked to make sure the call was still connected. Then her grandmother said, "He would have loved that baby." Renata sat with that for a while. The office was quiet around her. The twins were asleep. The sign was visible through the window, catching the March light at an angle that made the letters look almost warm. She held the phone in both hands and did not say anything else, because there was nothing that needed saying, and Josephine had taught her a long time ago that the most important silences are the ones you are willing to stay inside. A name on a door means nothing. The name on the paper is the one that matters. Renata had heard those words as a child, filed them away as a teenager, carried them as a professional truth in her 20s, and received them as a prophecy in the worst year of her adult life. She understood them now as something different from all of those things. She understood them as her own. Not her mother's lesson, not her grandfather's legacy, hers. Something she had passed through fire to own completely. This is what this story has always been about, underneath the documents and the legal filings and the name on the trucks. It is about the difference between the power that announces itself and the power that simply exists. It is about the women who build things quietly, who hold things carefully, who do not perform their strength for rooms that are not paying attention. It is about the cost of that silence and the purpose inside it. Patience is not the absence of power. Sometimes patience is the most precise form of it. Renata Moreau had been co-signing the payroll since before James Voss ever said her name at a company function. The company had always known whose name was on the paper. It had simply been waiting, the way good things built carefully are always willing to wait for everyone else to catch up. If this story reached something in you, if you've ever been the quietest person in a room that underestimated you, or if you've ever held something carefully while someone else claimed it loudly, we would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us what part stayed with you. And as always, tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. Renata set her phone face down on the desk. Outside the window, the sign held its ground in the March light, patient and permanent, the way her grandfather had always intended it to be. In the back office, one of the twins made a small sound, and then went quiet again. Renata opened the desk drawer, the one that stuck slightly in damp weather, and rested her hand on Diane's letter for a moment, not reading it, just feeling the weight of it. And then she closed the drawer and turned back to the window, and the silence in the room was hers, completely and without condition, and it was enough.